Hello everybody, this is Dr. Joel Hunter at Truckee Meadows Community College, preparing to talk to you about Hinduism. And what I want to do is step through the key vocabulary of this religion, because you're going to need to take some time as you're reading the text to dig into those terms. Don't gloss over them. And I want to go through some of those vocabulary words that I need you to know. And this will be so that you excel on the quiz. And then I'm going to step through some of the questions that I've directed you to be able to answer the three key areas of the model. And so if you can answer a few of the questions that I've posed in the three sections, then you're going to be in great shape. And as part of the preparation for your quiz, I'm also going to mention, as we get into the position where it shows up, the challenge question for your Hinduism quiz. And this is going to be an extra credit question that is going to count as 10% of your quiz grade. So it's a significant amount that you can add to your quiz score, but it will take some work. And I'm going to tell you exactly what the question is when we get to the appropriate section. So let's get to the slides, and if you've got the workbook that I've uploaded, this would be a great time to pull that out and you can start taking. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so let's get right to the slides for Hinduism, and I'll stay down here in the corner as I point out where your readings are for this religion. It's the Smith book, pages 12 through 81. And the Novak has the primary texts, and it's selections from the Vedas, from the Upanishads, from the Bhagavad Gita, and then some extra more recent texts as well that are part of the corpus. So do have a look at those, and I'll tell you right now that as lucid and as helpful as the Smith book is, you will find amazing things to help you with the model in the Novak text, in the Novak readings. And I'll give you a couple examples of those as I get to them. But don't overlook the Novak, even though it is the primary texts for each religion, and sometimes it's kind of obscure. But I think as the model sinks in as the tool for you to examine the core beliefs and practices of each religion, I think you will understand better those primary texts and what they're trying to say. So let's move on, though. What we're going to do, the structure of this is very simple. We're going to talk about the key definitions. I'm not going to give you the definitions, that's your job, but I'm going to give you the key vocabulary that you need to understand, and then I'm going to give you some questions to help guide you through the model, the three key components that are specific to Hinduism. So let's get right to it and talk about the vocabulary. So in each case, I'm going to give you a word on a slide, and I give you this empty space in the workbook for you to work in and find the citations in the Smith and Novak books that you can record here. And I can tell you right now, one of the key words that I need you to know is samsara. So make sure that you understand what that is and how it fits into the scheme of the religion. Next would be, and this is something many of you have probably heard of, and it's used colloquially, it's used loosely, the word karma. But what I want you to look at, there's two senses of karma that are in your reading that are relevant to Hinduism. And the first sense that I need you to understand is the law of karma and how that fits into the religious scheme, particularly when we're talking about human anthropology. And anthropology is just, a fancy way of saying the study of human beings. And so each religion has an anthropology. Each religion has something to say about who humans are, what we essentially are, or what we become. And that is absolutely critical to understand in what a religion teaches. Every religion has one in one form or another. Some are more explicit than others, and Hinduism is pretty explicit when it comes to anthropology. So do have a look at karma, because that's part of human anthropology. And it's actually part of the unseen order as well when we're talking about the law of karma. So that is also crucial. And this is the sense in which most people think of it, as sort of a give and take. You reap what you sow. That kind of moral rule that's built into the universe. That's the way a lot of people take it. But look specifically at what Hinduism says the law of karma is and how it works. Next key term is moksha, and this also is really, really important for you to understand. It's a central part of the model, and so you'll need to look, and I need you to know that one for sure. What is Atman? And Atman is a core principle, particularly when it comes to the unseen order. This is also relevant to, again, anthropology, who humans are. So be sure to look at the texts that speak about Atman. What is Brahman? You may have heard of this term. So this is also part of the unseen order. I need you to know this because that Brahman and Atman are closely connected, and sometimes they're used almost interchangeably. So it's important to understand two things now that I've told you that. First thing is you need to understand what's distinct about those terms. Why is one term used in another if they're sometimes used interchangeably? And then second, how are they actually connected to one another within Hinduism? So this is discussed in your reading, so make sure that you understand that. A term probably almost all of you have heard is yoga. I need you to know what yoga is in the context of the religion. And so you will learn what that is and how it fits into the economy of salvation for Hinduism. So there are 4 kinds, and I'm going to mention them now as other terms that you need to know. And my pronunciation is not always very good at these things, but I'm just going to pronounce it sort of phonetically here. Jnana. So know what Jnana yoga is. Know what Bhakti yoga is. Know what Japam yoga is. And know what karma yoga is. There's that word again, karma. So this is the other sense I mentioned that you need to know and be able to make distinct from karma as a law, sort of a universal law. Okay? So those are the 4 kinds of yoga. Now moving on, Raja. What is Raja? Samadhi. I always trip over this one. Samadhi is also very, very important term for you to know. You definitely need to know this one and how it fits into the model. And now I'm going to get into some terms, and I'll mention them if they're more minor terms or still really important for you to know. But I don't want you to trip over them. So sannyasin is an important term, but it is not a central term. And by the way, I should mention, anything that I put on the vocabulary list, you should expect to appear as part of a quiz question. So this is why I do need you to know it, and then to understand how the religion is organized around this vocabulary and how it explicates what their beliefs are and what their practices are. What is jiva? What is maya? Also a very important term. What is lila? What are the Vedas? So this is moving over into the Novak, where you are presented material from the Vedas. So what are those? They're texts, I'll tell you that much. But what exactly is unique or special about these texts? How do they fit into the written component of Hinduism? What are the Upanishads? What is the Bhagavad Gita? This is a text that is written, that is read frequently in other contexts, maybe not even a religion class or a philosophy class, but maybe in a literature class, like a world literature class. Bhagavad Gita, very famous text, very important text. And actually I have a quote for you from that that will illustrate one of the points I wanted you to grasp in the model. And then this is almost lastly here, but because this is sort of almost an appendix to the chapter in the Smith text, and that is, what is Sikhism? How is it related to Hinduism? Is Sikhism related to other religions? And so I want you to understand what is different about Sikhism, even though it grew out of, at least in part, from Hinduism. It certainly grew up in India, I believe it's the northern part of India. So have a look at Sikhism and understand what that is. It could have a chapter all to itself in, a class that was more dedicated to Hinduism or to the religions of Southern Asia. But for the Smith text, he assigns it just a small place because he's focusing on religions that represent a larger population. Okay, now I want to move from the vocabulary into the 3 core elements of your model and give you some focus questions to help you unpack how Hinduism answers the 3 parts of this model, how Hinduism fits into the model. And if you can answer at least a couple of these questions, you should be well on your way to really grasping how it works. Okay, so remember that when we talk about the human predicament, we're talking about what salvation is from, what this unsatisfactory situation is, that, according to religions, applies to all human beings. And so another way of saying this, using the sort of health and wellness model, is that the human predicament gives us our diagnosis of our condition. What is the prognosis for us as we naturally are? So it tells us what our illness is. It tells us in the prison model, then it would tell us what is the cause of our captivity, what keeps us enslaved. Okay? And then maybe what are our prospects for freedom? Okay. So here's the first question for you. What are the 4 things that Hinduism says we want? Which of these things are permanent or immutable? Which are transient or mutable? So if you can identify those 4 things that Hinduism says we all want, there you go. That's part of the anthropology. That's saying what all humans desire. What are the 2 paths to the things we want? Which path is more likely to lead to the higher things we can have? And there again, if you remember in the model video, I spoke about how because what we're talking about isn't always representable by concrete language, we have to use metaphors, just like poets have to use metaphors or create metaphors in order to express things that are more intangible. So when we say higher things that we can have, we're not talking about spatial position. We're not talking about things that we can have that are way up on a shelf. No, we're talking about more like divine things. What kind of divine things can we have? And specifically in the context of this question, which path will lead us to be able to have and enjoy those divine things? Okay. What does Hinduism have to say about pleasure and pain? And again, we're talking about anthropology here. This is something common to all human beings, and Hinduism has something specific to say about the role of pleasure and pain in our lives. What does Hinduism teach about worldly success? However one chooses to define success. For example, wealth, fame, power, what have you. You can plug in your own measure for success there. Whatever that is, whatever success means to you, for you to be successful in this world. What does Hinduism teach about that? Why do people often become dissatisfied with pursuing success, according to Hinduism? So notice there that it's sort of leading you into that diagnosis of the human condition, the human predicament, that maybe we all in our own ways desire success, but that for whatever reason we reach a point where even if we've achieved it all, there's something left over. There's something ultimately unsatisfying about that. And so what happens then? Which of the two paths is limited? How does Hinduism describe those limits? Okay, so here we're delving not only just in the human predicament part, we're also talking about the unseen order, perhaps, where these two questions, these two core elements of the model might intersect or overlap a bit, where in order to understand the two paths that we pursue of our own accord, of naturally, and one of these paths, according to Hinduism, is limited, or at least more limited than the other path. And so it would be good to know, if you are on the more limited path, well, how do I recognize that? How do I know when I've hit one of those limits? What kind of experiences would I have? What kind of emotional state maybe, would I be in when I'm hitting up against the limits of the one path? Okay? And then finally, if you can answer a few of those questions, then you're in a position to summarize the Hindu account of human anthropology. In other words, who are human beings? What are we? What motivates us? What is there something about us that is unrealized, that is unfulfilled, that could be fulfilled if we could overcome whatever predicament or constraint we live under naturally. And now some additional questions that I put in the same section just to get you to think a little bit past the reading itself, although the reading will help you answer these. From the perspective of non-Hindus, is renunciation, and that's a term I haven't thrown at you yet, but renunciation is a key term in the alternative path, a path of liberation. From the perspective of non-Hindus, is renunciation a positive value or a disvalue? In other words, you're talking with your friends, and you say, "Wow, things haven't been going so great. Maybe I ought to try renouncing this, that, and the other thing. Maybe I just ought to renounce all the things that I currently value, or almost everything I currently value." How would that come across, do you think, with your friends? Would they think, "Oh, that's a great idea. You should totally do that," or would they say, "That's not very smart. That's not very wise. That's a disvalue"? So, from the perspective of non-Hindus, then, is renunciation a positive value or a disvalue? So if you can talk about that a bit, I think you'll really grasp the importance of this alternative path that's discussed in your text. Okay, here's a longer question for you, but it's one that is one that I've thrown in because it's come up in the past when I've taught this as sort of a barrier, and I can't always tell if when somebody raises a question like this, whether it's an inability to use the imagination or whether it's an unwillingness to sort of think beyond what they're familiar or comfortable with. And I grant that thinking about some of these questions may be an uncomfortable experience. That's the nature of religion. I mean, it's an existential concern. If it doesn't actually push a button with you, then there's either I'm not doing my job explaining it, or there's a disconnect with what we're talking about. So let's take a look at this question, because for some of you it might really be a helpful question to start with even. So one reason one might find Hinduism implausible or false is that one is unaware of or does not recognize one's Brahman self. You remember from your vocabulary, Brahman, right? So you got to know that word. According to Hinduism, why do some not recognize their Brahman self? So notice what I'm doing in that question. I'm recognizing, I'm showing you that, hey, you may not be aware of your Brahman self. And guess what? Hinduism says, totally get that. Hinduism says, well, sure, common thing. So it's actually not a criticism of the religion to say, oh gosh, I don't get that. I'm not aware of a Brahman self. I don't recognize that. And I mean that's not a strike against religion, because the religion says, yep, that's right. Some people don't, and here's why. They have an account. They have an explanation for that. So that's what I want you to look into. And Smith does a good job of discussing that. And by the way, the Novak readings also, some of the selections in the text will help. Okay, next question. What restricts joy or bliss in this life? So this is a great question. I mean, most people would say, gosh, I would like more bliss. And to know what it is that inhibits that, it would be good to know. So Hinduism tells us. To what things are we attached that Hinduism recommends we detach from? So detach or detachment is a key concept. Now that's the English term, so you need to think, okay, well, what is the Hindu term here for detachment? And it's in your vocabulary. To what things are we attached that Hinduism recommends we detach from? Okay? And then I think this is the last one in this slide, in this section of the slides, and that is to explain the process of reincarnation, or as it's sometimes called, the transmigration of the soul. This is a key element in not only the anthropology, but then in the larger scheme of the unseen order, how the universe is ordered, how it works for human souls, and why we exist, and what our ultimate destiny, those kinds of questions. So here again is another. This is the kind of question actually that crosses all three categories of the model, from the human predicament to salvation to the supreme good. So I've put it here because it's good to start here and understand why reincarnation is a problem that has to be overcome, why it's part of the predicament. Okay? Okay, so next, second part of the model is salvation. And so now we're looking at, again, the cure to our illness. We've been told what the diagnosis is. We've been told what our prognosis is. Okay, so where's my medicine? What's the cure? Or, to put it in the context of freedom, we're asking, so what's the way out of this prison? What is the way of liberation from our captivity? Okay. So, what is the Hindu perspective on renunciation? What is its positive value? And you remember from the last few slides ago that I mentioned renunciation and as a key concept, as one of the paths of liberation, or I didn't say it at the time, but I'm saying it now, but it is one of the paths that helps us out of the human predicament according to Hinduism. So now we need to know, well, what is its positive value according to Hinduism? Which goal for something greater than oneself is usually first encountered and considered? So this is something that I mentioned in the model video. I can't remember if it was actually the introduction model, or the introduction video, or the model video, but I mentioned it, so I'm going to repeat it because it's helpful to remember this. You know, a lot of people want a solution, like a pill or something, and say, oh gosh, if I just take the pill, or if I just do this one thing, all this big problem is solved. And of course, it's not like that. Life is complicated, and sophisticated religions recognize that any solution to a complicated problem is also not going to be easy. Maybe that's why a lot of religions aren't actually tried, because they're too hard. But Hinduism has something to say then about the stages people usually go through as they are seeking something greater than themselves. Sorry, it's a little noisy here. I just went and paused. I didn't lose my train of thought. So what is what is the first stage? Where's that first place that people look for transcendence? Okay, next key concept when it comes to understanding the Hindu version of salvation, and that is, what is detachment? What is that? Is the desire for infinite being, and desire there, by the way, you should circle as a, ooh, that's a flag word, that's a warning word in this religion, is the desire for infinite being, or infinite knowledge, or infinite bliss, is that harmful, or is it not? And then be able to explain why. Okay, and so the hint is that desire is typically something that is behind our attachments to things that are not healthy, that do not lead to fulfillment. And so, well, what if I desire infinite knowledge? What if I desire nirvana? What if I desire the supreme good? Is that bad? Okay, so that it may seem to be a contradiction, but I think you'll see how that is resolved in your text. So have a look at that. How are Atman and Brahman related? And I mentioned this earlier as something that you needed to focus on. So that was in the human predicament section, or sorry, that was in the vocabulary. So now I'm mentioning it again, as this is where those terms are relevant. So you need to be able to understand the connection between these concepts and what they have to do with salvation. What is Om? Right back there behind me. A-U-M, phonetically. What is Om? The Novak texts have lots of beautiful primary texts that describe Om and its place in the, not just in salvation and the path of salvation, but also in the supreme good. In what ways are yogas ways to God? And there are multiple yogas, so you'll need to look at how these are sort of different paths to work toward God. So have a look at that. What are the 4 distinct yogas? I just mentioned that. And what is distinctive about each? Why are there 4? Is there something that makes sense about there being 4 and not 10, for example? Why those 4? And finally, characterize the caste system and its religious function. So a lot historically has changed about this, particularly since Gandhi, and since political independence in India. And so this is an interesting question because it is one of the places that the religious teaching and life intersects with political and social life. And so it's really helpful to understand this too, because this tells us a little bit about some of the practical implications. And we can look at the question of, well, is maybe the gradual dissolution of the caste system, is that consistent with Hinduism? Is that like finally, Hinduism is making a really broad impact in the society, or does it represent a loss of the potency of Hinduism in Indian society? So have a look at the caste system and its religious function. Finally, we have the third element of the model, and that is the ultimate end, or the supreme good, what salvation is to. And so again, we're talking about the health metaphor. Well, what would it be like to be fully healthy? And in the freedom context, what is it? What would it be to be fully free, to have no chains that bind us, or the higher life, as I mentioned, or take that metaphorically. Okay, so I have just a few questions for this section. Again, as I've mentioned, and I'll just repeat this because it's so important, is as you answer some of the questions that I've brought up earlier, you'll find that these do not stay nice and contained in their one place in the model, but that some of them bridge into other parts of the model. And so even I mentioned one that has to do with all 3 elements of the model. So I'm trying to bring the focus of the question where it belongs sort of in the model, or where it best fits in the model, but don't force it. I mean, in other words, you don't have to just limit yourself when you're answering these questions to just that one category, in this case, the supreme good. Okay, you may need to talk about the other parts of the model to help make sense of that, and that's okay. Okay, so is Hinduism polytheistic? Now, polytheism, poly means many, theism or theos is a Greek word meaning God, and so many gods is what polytheistic means. So is Hinduism polytheistic? And explain your answer. So here, this is not actually a hint to the answering the previous question, because now I'm using the singular God. And you will find, Smith does this, you will find this in the primary text as well in Novak. So who or what is God in Hinduism? Is God more like a personal being, as the Abrahamic faiths are, that is, Judaism, Christianity, Islam? Is God like that God, a personal being, or is God maybe some form of an impersonal force? So in other words, not one that has a personality, not one that has a character or sort of a moral compass or things like that, but more of a universal force. Okay? So what is God? Who or what is God in Hinduism? And I don't know if you can see, I'm really not smirking, but I am kind of grinning a little bit, because a question like this often has a both and answer, even though I've set it up as an either or. Don't assume that there's only that the full explanation comes by taking one single side to this. It may be more like, well, you know, the majority of the time it seems like God is this, whereas some of the time, though, God seems like this other thing. And so the really interesting and fun part to doing this is to figure out, okay, well, how do these two things fit together if they do? But to recognize sometimes that the answer is complex here gives you a lot more insight into the nature of the unseen order and the supreme good. Okay, Hinduism acknowledges that our earthly life is transitory and physical death cannot be avoided. Nevertheless, it teaches that infinite being is attainable. How? How can that be? If we're mortal beings, anthropology, okay, if we're mortal beings, how is it possible that we can attain infinite being? Okay? Possessing or experiencing a positive value like knowledge, bliss, or being is notoriously difficult to describe. How does Hinduism describe it? How would you describe it? I'm inviting you then to sort of use your own filter or perspective here, and just take a moment to think about where you stand as you come to understand what Hinduism says about the difficulty of explaining the value of attaining not only what these things are or are like, but of attaining them too. So this is a common problem in religion that has to describe things that are sometimes intangible, even if they are experienced directly and unquestionably, is that the language sometimes is not there. We just don't have the words to describe what it is we either just experienced or that we're trying to grasp from somebody else's discussion. So, infinite being, infinite knowledge, infinite bliss, the positive value of those things, how does Hinduism try to describe it? Okay? And again, the Novak text, very helpful here. And then I think this might be the last question, since it is about Sikhism, is what is distinctive about Sikh belief and practice. So there I'm asking, in distinctive, I'm asking what is what is different about Sikh belief and practice as opposed to Hinduism, what sets it apart. Okay? And that is all, my friends. Good luck with your, I'll go back to the last slide. Good luck with your studies as you work through the text. And I am going to postpone the due date since I have been late getting this video up to you. And so be looking for the revised due date as I finally actually do complete the video and get it uploaded. I'll decide when I actually complete that how many extra days to give you. But don't worry about rushing through this. I want you to take your time and answer as many questions as you can, not only to prepare for the quiz, but to really get your hands dirty with the texts and with the model. And be in touch with me if you have any questions, any problems. Be glad to talk about them and answer what I can for you. Otherwise, good luck on the quiz, and I'll see you next time for Buddhism. Take care.